live stream and recording, and we should be good to go. All right, so these slides are for both chapter 4 and 5. All right, so first a competitive strategy and then innovation strategies. All right, so let's talk about strategy first, and then we'll talk about the other things. So strategy is a roadmap of the actions that you are going to take to achieve the mission and goals that you set forth last time. Okay, so as you're going through we do the lecture. In theory, you should be working on your project and following the lectures with working on that specific area of your project. That way you don't accumulate a lot of work to do at the end. These strategies should be action-oriented, okay? And they should be based on the opportunities and strengths and competencies that your organization should have, okay? In order to accomplish your strategy, though, you have to have a really good, and I would say deep understanding of the industry, okay? So if you don't understand what your industry is and you can't articulate that to me, then there's going to be a problem because you're not going to be able to be successful, okay? You need to make sure your strategy is clear and concise. You don't want to write a novel, okay? And then your outcome of that strategy needs to be something that gives you sustainable competitive advantage, okay? So before I go on about speaking of strategy and whatnot, your concept paper is due tomorrow, okay? So make sure you submit it to iLearn. You should have a Dropbox now for your group. Like I said, if you're not in a group, you won't be able to submit anything, okay? Which will mean you won't get grades. Okay. There we go. Okay, so developing a strategy. First, we do the vision, the mission, and the business model that we worked on last class, okay? We look at our core competencies, define what those are, okay? We really understand the industry and what the industry context is for ourselves and our competitors. We want to understand where we fit into there, okay? And where our competitors fit. The other thing that we want to do, and this is actually on one slide later on, is we look at strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. We do a SWOT analysis, okay? So we're actually going to go in and I'm going to show you how to sign up for your free Lucid chart if you haven't already done that. Pretty much everything that you want to do these days, there's a template for. And Lucid Chart, through the students program, you get free access to the premium service. And it has things like risk matrix and SWOT analysis and Venn diagrams, anything that you could possibly want. There's probably a template that already exists that someone spent the time to create, okay? Save you a little time. You're also going to identify the key success factors for your business, what your strategic options are, and you're going to eventually transition that strategy into a KPI or key performance indicator, just another word way of saying a metric, for your action plans, okay? So you're going to have 8 action plans that are tied to a KPI. So a KPI might be, we're going to grow the industry that we've chosen by 20%, or we're going to capture 37% of the industry in year 1, whatever that might be, okay? All right, so, I'm not going to cover things that are in the book, okay? You should be reading the book, but sometimes I'll put in the slides a key piece of the book that you should pay attention to, okay? So page 69, there's a figure in there, okay, a little flow chart. I can't reproduce it. Otherwise, I can't live stream the lectures. So it's a trade-off, okay? So you have to read the book. Otherwise, I just have to stop live streaming and recording the lectures. I have to be in compliance with copyright laws. So if you take a look at that, that would be helpful. Speaking of which, I posted the exams over the weekend, okay? Both the final and the midterm. Final, you won't be having access to for a while, but the midterm, I believe for this class, I actually allowed you to go into it, like as of the time I posted it. I strongly discourage you from taking it at this point. You haven't read enough of the book. If you haven't read the book, you are not going to pass the exam. You don't get a do-over. So, but it is out there, so you know what to study for. Okay, for the midterm. So take advantage of that. Okay, and I will allow the final a little bit later in the course. I'll open it up, but you'll have at least a week to do it. I'll maybe open it up a couple weeks before that. Okay. It does no good to cheat, by the way, because the random answers and questions, they're pulled from a pool. So you may not get the same questions as your neighbor, right? All right, so how do we develop a sound dynamic strategy, okay, for the market? Why are we pursuing the objective? Okay? We must have had a reason. Let's articulate what that reason is. Where are you going to be active? Okay? How will you achieve that objective? When are we going to act, and how fast are we going to act? How do we differentiate our product, and whom are we both competing with and cooperating with? Okay. There are times that we may decide to cooperate with a competitor because it gives us a competitive advantage to do so. Okay. So we might do something like a joint venture. We'll talk about those in a little bit, some options. So we're not going to review this vision, mission, and the business model today, but if you didn't attend class last week, it would be in your best interest to review that material. Okay. All right. So your core competencies. This just boils down to what are the unique capabilities that you offer to your customers, and what unique resources do you have? Now, neither of those may apply to you. And if that's the case, then do you have a unique method for managing the same resources that your competitors do? Okay. So let's think about this from, let's say, an Uber or Lyft perspective. Okay. Uber and Lyft essentially do the same thing. Okay. It's not that they have unique capabilities. It's not that they have unique resources. It's that they are doing things a unique way to fulfill their particular market. Lyft's, at least my experience, this is all from my experience, Lyft seems to be very customer focused. Okay. They want you to be happy. They talk to you. They try to build that personal connection with you when you get in a Lyft. Okay. Uber's a tactic, on the other hand, is usually around price and convenience. There's usually a lot more Ubers around. Anybody drive for Uber or Lyft, or both? Okay. Usually you'll see, especially in the non-urban areas, you see a lot more Ubers around than you will Lyfts. Okay. So they've got their own core competencies. I would tell you that Uber is not known for its customer service. I can tell you that from my own experience and from just in general what you see on the news. Okay, but they have their own unique way of doing business. Okay, and I believe that there was actually a really good example, just to. Yeah, I can't remember. There's a good example in the book, though. That just goes in the pile there, yeah. Okay, so you'll want to look at what your core competencies are. Okay. Actually, let's go back to that for one moment. I'll give you another example. So I worked for a company that did e-voting software. Okay, they made voting devices and whatnot. It's not a unique field. There have been people making voting devices since the 1800s. Okay, some of those machines are still in use today. So it's not unique, right? They don't have a unique capability necessarily. They're using the same type of resources. People used to work for the other election companies. Okay? But what they're doing is they're using, or they went out of business, but they were using unique methods for how they were going to do voting systems. In some cases, they had some unique capabilities. It's just that the market wasn't ready for those capabilities yet. So they were doing things a little bit more uniquely than their competitors in terms of how they put all the pieces together. Okay? So the industry, describe your industry, all right? You want it to be narrow in focus, but you don't want it to be too narrow. So it's sort of a balancing act. I can't really give you a hard and fast rule, okay? So I'll give you too broad, though. The transportation industry, way too broad, okay? The energy industry, way too broad, okay? Narrow and focused, here's an example. The electric passenger vehicle industry in Europe, okay? That would be narrow and focused. Maybe it's too narrow, maybe you won't find any data and you might need to expand a little bit, but it's much narrower than saying the transportation industry. Okay? Now, if you can't find data on your particular industry that you've selected, let's say you're doing something completely out of the realm of what exists today. but not too far out, as I told the group that asked me on Slack over the weekend. Let's say that you are going to build a mining operation on the moon. Okay, the technology exists to do that today. We've been to the moon for 50 years, unless you're a conspiracy theorist, I guess, and don't believe that. Okay, but we've had the ability to go to the moon for quite a while. We just haven't gone there for whatever reason. We have rockets that could get us into orbit today, so we would be leveraging an existing launch infrastructure. Okay, so then in my view for this project, if you were to say, I want to build a mining company on the moon and extract resources, that might be doable in the next couple of years. You develop a little bit of technology, but we've got the technology for rovers and digging, and we've gone to other planets and asteroids and stuff. So we do have that capability, and we have launch vehicles. So if you were to tell me that we want to do a company that does mining on the moon, as long as you tell me you're going to use existing infrastructure like rockets and stuff, and you're not going to have to go out and build new rockets, then I would tell you that would be probably a feasible option. Now the question is, how do you determine that market size? Well, no one's done it before, right? You're the first mover. So how do you determine that market? Well, you try to find something close. So what I would do, and maybe someone is going to do this, I don't know, but I would look at the space launch industry first of all, and look at that market and that industry. Okay. And then I would also look at mining on Earth. It's going to be different, but at least you could get some idea of the cost involved on the Earth, and then you would have to do some sort of multiplication factor for the fact that it's more complex to do that sort of thing in zero gravity or low gravity, I guess, on the moon. Okay, so you would have to use the closest industry that you can think of. Okay, but you don't want to be too narrow. So how do you do that? You consider two dimensions. One is the scope of your product and service. You don't want it to be too narrow or too broad, and same with geography. So if you go and come up with an idea and you say that I'm going to focus on the Ecuador market, okay, that's probably far too narrow. It's not a very large country, right? So, but if you said I'm going to focus on the European market initially, and then we're going to move into North America, that would be a broader market. That would probably be okay, right? Likewise, it also would depend on your product. If you were to say that I want to focus on the buggy market for horse-drawn vehicles in the United States, that would be too narrow because a focus for the product, because how many of you rode on a horse and buggy to school today, right? Nobody does it anymore, okay? But that might actually be a feasible operation in another country where they don't have as much of a transportation network, okay? But if you just say that's what I'm going to do in the US, it wouldn't be a good option. The next thing you have to do is look at the legal and regulatory issues. And we will get to this a bit more in the class later on, but let me just give you some ideas for where you can start looking for those. First of all, is anybody, this would be helpful because I'm going to help you out here if you respond to me. If y'all are quiet, I know it's early in the morning, I won't be able to help you out. Is anybody planning to do anything where you accept credit cards for payment or debit cards for your business? Nobody? Even if you might, okay. You're going to be wanting to look into the PCI standards. It's an industry standard, stands for payment card industry. It's a security standard that you, in order to accept payment cards like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, you have to comply with those standards. It's not a government regulation. It's not a legal law, but it's just, it's an industry regulation that's self-policed by the industry, okay? If you do not follow PCI standards and you accept credit cards and you have a breach, you're on the hook for the money that's lost by those people's cards, okay? Not Visa, MasterCard. But if you follow PCI, then you're not responsible either, okay, if there's a breach or something, okay? As long as you follow PCI. Anybody planning to do something in the healthcare space? Nobody? All right, how about targeting a government customer or a government market? Anybody think about that yet? Let me actually go back to healthcare. If you're doing healthcare, HIPAA for people's personal health information will apply. So if you're doing an Apple Watch type device that tracks people's health records, you might need to worry about HIPAA compliance with that data, okay? If you're going into the government space, if it's a federal government, then you're going to probably follow FedRAMP's requirements, okay? If you're going into Anybody doing anything where you might capture personal data, personal information of people? Maybe, okay. If you're in California, then a regulation you're gonna have to think about is, I shouldn't say that, even if you're not in California, if you're dealing with California consumers, okay, then you have to deal with the CCPA, which just happened a couple weeks ago, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That's a regulation that you're gonna have to think about. Okay. Anybody planning to be international? Well, if you are, you're gonna have to worry about the GDPR in Europe, General Data Protection Regulation. Okay. These are all things that you have to think about as a business. Okay. Some of you might be shaking your head or nodding your head because you've heard me say this before in other classes. Okay. If you are going to be doing anything, anybody do anything related to the financial industry in general, just financial, that kind of thing. Anybody planning to make your company public at some point? You might have to comply with things like Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, okay, or Dodd-Frank, which is another federal regulation around companies and financials. You might have to comply with banking acts. So there's a lot of different things. You'd have to really look at your industry and maybe do some Google searches of what type of regulations apply. Okay. I will say though that from a privacy perspective, a data privacy perspective, the easiest is Europe. The hardest, I would say, is the US because we don't have a federal law. I think it's very unlikely, and the way that our political system works these days, to ever get any type of privacy law at a national level. So we're going to see eventually probably 50 different laws. And we're getting to that point. I think we have 15, 20 laws on the books now across the different states. And it's going to be a mess for businesses to comply with all those different laws. Okay. The next thing is you have to be able to describe the growth rate of the industry and which stage it's in. There's 4 stages: emergence, there's growth, there's the maturation stage, and then there's decline. Okay. So you're going to have to look at your particular industry and determine what it is. If it's a new industry like the moon example, well, that would be in the emergence phase. Okay. Now, you also have to determine what the growth rate of the industry is. Some industries are in high growth mode, 150%, 200%, 1,000%. Okay. Others are in low growth mode, maybe 4 or 5%. Okay. Still others might be in decline. So you have to really look at the opportunities there. If you want my honest opinion, you probably don't want to go into an industry that's in decline because you wouldn't get very many investors, if anybody, interested. Okay. So you certainly don't want to go down that path. The next thing is you're going to have to prepare a statement of your profit potential and the type of typical return on investment for that particular industry. So you would then look at competitors or other companies that do similar things to see what type of ROI they have for their profit, okay, for the return on, ROC, return on capital, okay. So if you looked at a technology company, the average return might be 16, 17%, right? But if you looked at, say, I don't know, some other company, an older, like steel, maybe it's only 3%, okay? Which means that you're not going to get as much return on the capital that people invest if you're going into the steel industry, okay? You can use the SE website, which I've linked to, if you want to research firms in your industry and determine the ROC ratios. That's usually in their financial statements, okay? Public companies are required to post their financials quarterly there. So if you're thinking about a public company that might be somewhat related to the space that you're going into, maybe not identical, say Google, for example, you should be able to find the return on capital and things like that in the financial statements, okay? It's not a bad idea for you to be able to learn how to read financial statements, okay? Anybody in here finance majors or accounting? Those are the people you want on your team because they're going to probably be able to read those financial statements, okay? The other thing you're going to want to do is describe the competitors in your industry, okay? What you don't want to do is have, say, one of the folks from the Entrepreneur Center in here, and I don't anticipate them being here when you do your presentations anyways, but let's just say one of them was in the room. You don't want to tell your competitors and then have them say, those are not your competitors. You don't understand your competitors. That would be a really bad thing. You really want to understand who your competitors really are in that industry, okay? So you're going to really want to do some research in that area. Okay. Another piece that you want to read up on if you're not familiar with it already is Porter's 5 forces model. Okay, and there's the pages in the book if you want to take a look at that and refresh yourself. Okay, now a SWOT analysis. Have you done these before? Okay, you're going to do them, and what you can do is you can sign up here. Okay. Oops. This website will allow you to sign up for a student account. You have to follow the directions. I think you sign up and then you have to contact support using the little link inside here, okay, and say, hey, I'm a student. I want to upgrade my account to premium for free. Okay. And then, yeah, right here. So you sign up here for free, no credit card required. Then you contact their support. Their support's usually pretty good, but this isn't the 300-person class, so this one shouldn't be so bad. I would imagine you probably get a response within a day, if not sooner. Okay. Now, once you've done that, this will take you to a page. By the way, you can search for anything, and if you put, like, say, Lucidchart SWOT analysis, it'll take you to their template and their little write-up about SWOT analysis. Venn diagram, whatever it might be, you can go and do that, and usually they have a template. Okay. Then you can click the appropriate button. If you've done it before, you don't need to do this probably. Okay. So you can just go ahead and go here. Okay. You can do it from a template here, and if you are new to it, you can click here and it will tell you all about it. Okay. So right here are all the bits of information you probably will need to be able to do a SWOT analysis. Okay. And you just keep going. There's tons of stuff. Okay. Here we go. So here's a SWOT analysis. So this works. Strengths, weaknesses. So let's look at strengths first. Flight. This is for Superman, by the way. Okay. Super hearing, supervision, speed, flight. Okay. Weakness is kryptonite, whatever it's called. I'm not a Superman fan, you can tell. Solar radiation. Opportunities. Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen. Okay. Threats. Lex Luthor, Silver Banshee. I don't know who these are. Okay. I only knew Lex Luthor. Okay. You would do something like that for your business. Okay. All right. Now, next thing is the barriers to entry. There's a table on page 78. So if we go, I don't know if you have your books or not, but I'll pull it up here and just mention it. Okay. So some barriers of entry. Economies of scale. Okay. If a company has already built out the infrastructure and built products in this space, let's use Walmart, for example. Walmart has a huge amount of stores. They've got a huge economy of scale because they're so large. Okay. If you're going to start out a new business just like Walmart, you're going to struggle compared to them. They have economies of scale. You can't get things at the quantities that they purchase if you're just starting out. So they have an advantage and you have that barrier. Okay. Cost advantages independent of scale. Okay. So let's say, let's use Target as an example. Target has certain cost advantages because they've already developed processes for how to check out people and inventory processes and things like that. Okay, so they have a cost advantage there. Product differentiation. So I look around the room and I see a lot of Apple laptops. Okay, so if I wanted to go create a new laptop that competed with Apple, I would have a hard time. Okay, because they already have that brand recognition out there. Contrived deterrence. So let's say you enter the market, you decide that you're going to compete with Walmart, and Walmart just starts lowering their prices. Okay. That would be an example of that. Government regulation. So let's use, I know this is really not the case anymore because of streaming, but let's say you decide you want to start your own TV station. I don't know why you would these days, but let's just say you wanted to do that, okay? How are you going to get your TV station in the air because the government controls airwaves. Okay, so you would have to go and bid on spectrum in the radio frequencies at auction, and you would be at a disadvantage because other companies that are existed would have a lot more money to be able to go do that sort of thing. Okay, same with like the cellular industry. They have auctions of the old. We used to watch TV. Maybe you guys, some of you are old enough to have watched it over the air. Before HDTV, everything was analog. You had channels 1 through, I think, 13 were VHF, and then above 13 was UHF, which is ultra high frequency. And you had 2 dials on your TV, one for the lower channels, then you would switch to this U channel, and then you'd switch to the other one, which had a ton more channels. But you had to be closer to the broadcast antenna. Okay. Long time ago. I remember that. I was a kid when we had black and white TV. Okay. But over time, when we decided to launch HDTV around the turn of the new millennium, that old spectrum of radio frequencies was not going to be used anymore. And the quicker we got to HDTV, which is digital and is more efficient, the sooner we could free up that spectrum for other things. And so a lot of the cellular companies have purchased it for the 4G networks that we use today. If we hadn't have gotten rid of the standard definition TV that went over analog airwaves, we probably wouldn't be able to have as good of internet connectivity on our mobile devices as we do today, because there was a limited amount of spectrum of channels available for us to use. Okay, so that's a way the government kind of provided a regulation there to make that difficult. The last thing here is switching costs. Okay, so let's say you have, has anybody switched between either Windows and Mac or Mac and Windows? Okay, there's a cost associated with that that makes it a barrier for people to not want to move. Companies are the same way. So let's say I'm a company and I've been in business for 5 years and I have invested heavily in Windows. Okay, I have Windows Office, I have Windows computers, I have Windows servers. It's very costly for me to go and switch to Mac, okay, because I've made that huge investment in the Windows infrastructure. That's a switching cost. Okay. Likewise, if I'm a Mac user, and maybe I've invested in iTunes and iPhone and iPad and Macs and Mac software, it's very difficult for me to go and start switching to other things like Android, because what about all my iTunes stuff I've already purchased? Okay, I lose all that if I move to Android. So therefore, it makes it more sticky for the customer, where the customer is less likely to switch because of that switching cost. Okay. Now, if you think about that from an enterprise perspective, it's the same way as I just said for the Windows example. If a company is invested in a bunch of tablets for the field and mobile phones for their workforce and apps that only run on Mac, they are not going to switch to Windows. Okay, so you want to think about those switching costs as well. And by the way, the switching costs can be other things as well. So that's kind of an example that you can all think of from a consumer perspective. Here's another switching cost. Let's say you're an organization and you run a website of some sort. Okay, and part of your running a website is that you have to have dedicated network connections to your customers for some reason. Okay, especially on the government side, this can be true. The switching cost of telecom is extremely expensive. Once you sign up with AT&T, they make it so complicated and expensive for you to switch to, say, Verizon. You don't want to do it because the impact to your business is so great. So then when AT&T raises their prices and raises their prices and raises their prices again, you're kind of stuck. Okay? And then eventually you might get to the point where it's painful enough you decide you want to switch, and then you've got to put up with the pain of switching. Okay? And then you swear you're never going to switch again. And then the same thing happens when you go to Verizon. They keep raising their prices. Okay, some areas are very difficult to switch because of that cost. Okay, sometimes even cell phones can be expensive to switch. Okay, all right, the competitive advantage. That's again in the book. Okay. All right, so let's think about competitive advantage here. So this is just the factor that distinguishes you from your competitors. So how many of you fly on, say, Southwest Airlines? Okay. They're cheap, right? They go to a lot of different places. Sometimes you don't have to get off the airplane. Okay, if you're they'll just land, you stay in the airplane, you fly to the next city. Sometimes they fly direct. Okay. they have a competitive advantage over other airlines, like say United. United, if you want to fly to New York City from Ontario Airport, you don't fly to New York City generally. Actually, I don't think there are any flights on any airline except for maybe Southwest at Ontario that fly direct to New York City. So what do you have to do? You have to fly to San Francisco or Denver or Chicago, and then you can get to New York City. Okay. So Southwest is a competitive advantage for people who want to be able to fly direct, who want maybe a no-frills service and aren't willing to pay a lot of money. Okay. Southwest is usually a lot cheaper. Okay. I can fly on United, and it's going to cost me $500 to fly to San Francisco, but I can fly there for $49 on Southwest. That's Southwest's competitive advantage. Another thing that Southwest does is they only, well, okay, this may not be true anymore because they acquired another airline, but before they acquired AirTran Airways, they only flew Boeing 737 aircraft, period. No other types, which meant that they had common training for all their pilots could fly any aircraft. They had a lot of flexibility. Mechanics only had to worry about how to fix the 737. They didn't need to know how to fix the 787. Okay, so there's an advantage there, which lowers their cost. Okay? Whereas, say, American Airlines flies Boeing aircraft and Airbus aircraft. They even fly some regional jets that aren't made by those two companies. And within those companies, they fly many different aircraft. So they have to have mechanics for different areas, pilots that are rated on different aircraft, and then they have to have flight crews that are rated. So they don't have the flexibility of a flight crew sick. They don't have as much flexibility. They might have to cancel a plane flight, and you're stuck at the airport. So then you might be angrier. Not only that, you're going to pay a lot more for that service. Okay? But if you're flying on, say, one of the major airlines other than Southwest, you have multiple classes. You get to pick your own seats, so you can pick the best seats on the airplane, that sort of thing. Okay. So I would say that for American Airlines, their competitive advantage, or United for that matter, is you get choice. Okay, you can pay for a very expensive airplane ticket and get 5-star service. Okay, maybe 3 stars an airline we're talking about, not a hotel. Okay, but you probably get some better service than you would on Southwest. You also don't have to race to get on the airplane to get your seat and pick your seat. Okay, some other examples that with competitive advantage. So let's use Intel. It's in the book here. Intel is in, and this is becoming less true, by the way, but there was a period of time where this was very true. Intel was in most of the computers. Okay? AMD competed a little bit. There was another one, I think Cyrix was the name of it, in some computers. But generally speaking, if you bought a laptop, it had an Intel processor. If you bought a desktop, it had an Intel processor. Okay? Their competitive advantage was they were available everywhere, pretty much. They're their predominant platform. Now, today, not so much because we've got other types of processors, like the Android devices and the Apple iOS devices have their own processors in them. Okay. I think that's it for competitive advantage right now. The key success factors. So what are the industry competencies that are distinctive for you? Is there a lot of industry rivalry? If it's low, then you have a better chance of being successful. Okay? If you have a lot of competition, then it might be a lot more difficult for you to be successful in that particular industry. Okay? If you're early into an industry, not necessarily the first, because there are advantages to being first, but sometimes there are disadvantages. Okay? So being early is not necessarily great, but it can be. I'll give you an example. Apple was not the first to do media player, okay, for music. Microsoft had them before that. Creative had them before that. I don't remember. There are a lot of other ones that Belkin had them before that. Okay, they weren't very successful though. Okay. Apple really looked at what went wrong with those other companies, made those changes, and then launched a product that they felt would actually be successful. And eventually it was. In the beginning, it wasn't. They didn't have iTunes yet. Then basically, you were just using your own music. Okay, that barrier was too difficult for most people. How many of you know how to rip your own music from a CD? Okay. A couple of people. Well, when the iPad, or what do you call it, the iPod just first came out, that's how you got your music. Was you would load a CD in your computer and rip the music and then download it to your iPod. Okay. All right. So. Now, the next thing is the ability to obtain the knowledge needed to overcome the market ignorance. Okay, so if you're entering a new market, people might be ignorant of it and not know what to do, right? So if you've got the knowledge to overcome that, then you could be very successful. And then if there's a long lead time between the time that the early entrant goes in and the first follower enters the market, you have a higher likelihood of success because you have already maybe captured a large amount of that market. Okay? So if you go in 2020 and you launch something and your next competitor doesn't have the ability to go until 2023, you have a 3-year head start. Okay? All right, so the next thing is strategic options. So if, again, please review the pages listed there for like the competitive strategies. But for cooperative strategies, there are a lot of different ways that we can help to grow the business and move faster. Okay, one thing is we build alliances. That's a cooperative strategy, and that could be an alliance on a project. So let's say we're doing 4 products in our organization, and one of them we just determined that Apple would be a better partner for that particular project. So we might do a project-based alliance. Now, I will say this. These types of things, you want to have very good lawyers. You don't want to do this yourself. I'll tell you why. I worked for a company early in my career, like my second job, okay? And we did a joint development agreement with, which kind of fits in the second one there, but I'll mention it here. We did a joint development agreement for one product with Gateway, okay, which used to be a computer company. We didn't do a great job negotiating the paperwork, and our idea effectively got stolen, okay, and used for their purposes. And they didn't need us anymore once they had the idea. Okay? We didn't do a good job of protecting our intellectual property. Okay? So I mentioned projects. The next thing is joint research and development. So maybe you don't have a strong R&D function in your organization. Maybe you're going to align with a company that's focused on R&D, that has a really great R&D program, okay, where you jointly own the IP that comes out of that, and maybe you give them an exclusive license to it so that they can sell it in certain markets, and you have access to sell it in all of the other markets, okay? Another thing you could do is kind of along the next line here, co-marketing, where you jointly market products together, okay? And so this has been a model that companies have used to sell certain products. They'll jointly market them, okay? Another one is you do all the R&D yourself, you market it yourself, but you're not a production facility, so you partner with a company that has a production facility to actually build the product, okay? And you split the profits, okay? Another one is a joint venture where you effectively form a company made up of 2 companies owning it, or multiple companies, doesn't have to be 2. I'll give you an example of this. So I used to work for this organization called Hitachi Data Systems. Has anybody heard of them? Okay. They're up in Santa Clara, still in business. But when I worked there, they were partially owned by Hitachi, the Japanese company, and partly owned by Electronic Data Systems, which was a company that used to be part of GM, spun off, and now is part of HP Enterprise, okay? And while I was there, they decided to split the company. EDS sold it all, basically their portion, back to Hitachi, so that Hitachi would run it and solely own the company, okay? But they formed it because they wanted to build a services function in the computing and storage space, okay? And at the time, nobody was doing a great job. It was basically IBM and a bunch of fragmented companies. And so they felt like, well, you know what, if we built a joint team that had the best of Hitachi, they make hardware, they know how to make hardware, that sort of thing, but they don't know how to run computer systems, but EDS does. So that's why they formed a company like that. And that was their joint venture. You could do something like that as well as part of your strategic operations. The last thing here is merger. You can merge with another company. That could be what you're going to do for your strategy, okay? So you're going to merge with Google, or another way of putting this is Google is going to acquire you, okay? That might be one of your strategic options. With a startup, there are a number of things that you can do, and you'll hear this referred to as an exit strategy, okay? So how many of you think you want to go work for a startup after college? Okay. You might get some stock, okay, to entice you. One of the questions you should ask, besides how much is this stock worth today, because they should be able to tell you what their private valuation is, even if they're not a public company, is how can I actually sell this stock and make money on it? Because until you can sell it, it's worthless pieces of paper, okay? Has anybody ever seen I don't know if it was The Simpsons or Family Guy, one of those cartoons, and they have a toilet paper roll of stock options. Okay? I really don't remember. I think it's Simpsons. Okay? Stock options are like toilet paper. Okay? It's about all it's good for until the company has an exit of some sort. Either they go public and the stock is publicly worth something that you can go look up on the internet what the stock price is, or they sell to another company, so a merger and acquisition, and now you know how much your stock's worth because either you got cash from Google when they bought you, or you now have Google stock instead of the startup stock. Okay, so you can go find it on the internet how much Google's worth today. Okay, or you have some sort of other exit strategy where maybe you're going to be independent, and if you want to sell your stock, the company will buy it back at a certain price. That might be another strategy. Okay. Startups usually figure out what their strategy is pretty quick because you really have a hard time attracting people if you don't understand how you're going to exit. You might not know what you're going to do. You might have different options on the plate, and you say, well, we want to go public, but we have to achieve 300 million in revenue before we try to go public. Okay. If that doesn't work, then our plan is to sell to Google or Facebook or Microsoft or whoever it might be. So you're going to want to really look at what companies you could potentially sell yourself to. All right. Nobody wants to work for the startup company that never is going to do anything. Okay. Everybody wants to work for the company where they know that their money is going to be worth something, or their stock's going to be worth something some days. Okay. I can tell you I've worked for many startups, and I have yet to have a startup make me any money with their stock. Okay. None of them had good exit strategies. Okay. And they fell flat on their face. The only time stock's been worth anything to me is when it was at a public company. Okay. So take that with a grain of salt. If you're going to go to a startup, at least try to get some good money, okay? Because you can't pay your bills with stock. Okay? But if you think that there's an opportunity and you've seen the financials and you think that there could be some really big opportunities, then you could get some stock and maybe be the next Elon Musk. All right, so next unit is the innovation strategies. Okay? So we talked about very briefly just a few minutes ago about first mover. So when you're the first mover, you're the first to enter that market, okay? There's some advantages. If you have the right competencies, then you can benefit from that, okay? But you really have to have a vision and see how the technology is going to change before your competitors do, okay? If you wait for your competitors to make a move, you're too late, okay? Now, the disadvantage is it's uncertain. If you don't know what the customer wants, you're bound to fail. Okay. So this is where it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of class. You really have to understand what the customer is looking for. Do your research. Okay. Because if you're wrong, you may not have enough runway, and runway is capital to keep the business sustained. Okay. Especially if you're making a loss. Okay. You have revenue. If you don't figure this out, you're going to run out of runway before you get that product market fit. Okay. And you understand your customers. Another disadvantage is cost. If you're the first to do this, you've got to absorb all those costs yourself. There's no effort that someone else has already done that's going to enable you to get ahead, okay? Another thing is if you make an error in your product, your strategy, or just the execution, which execution is an area where a lot of companies fumble. They might have a really great product and a really good strategy, but if their execution fails, they're dead. Okay, or they're a cockroach that's going to die eventually. Okay, cockroach is a company that just won't die for some reason, even though they should have a long time ago, and I've worked for companies like that before. Okay, a lot of times what I've seen is poor execution. It could be that you have a really great, passionate CEO who knows the product, knows the market, is very interested in it, but is not a good executor of tasks. Okay, and execution of that strategy. So that's why you might see a startup founder starts up the company, starts building the team, and then they actually take it back, jump in the back seat and say, you know what, I recognize that I don't have the skills to be the visionary, that's the CEO, to actually execute on this vision. So I'm going to sit in the back seat, and I'm going to tell you what I think, but I'm going to let someone else with more experience. Okay? Google was like that. Okay? Google's founder stepped aside, let Eric Schmidt come in. He had more business experience. He ran the company for a very long time. And then eventually, I think it was Larry Page ended up back in the driver's seat once he'd had some more experience and time. Okay. Facebook, on the other hand, Zuckerberg has never left the driver's seat. Okay. even though he didn't have the experience, he figured it out. He was capable of doing that, and he felt like that was the best thing, and their board did as well. So you really want to find someone who's good at the execution. The other thing is the strategy. You could have a really great CEO who's great at executing, but has no vision. Okay. So that's when you start seeing things like chief strategy officers or chief product officers coming about to really develop that vision, because maybe the CEO just doesn't have that skill set. That goes back to understanding where your strengths are and executing on your strengths accordingly, and then building out the team for where you have gaps. The other strategy here is follower. Okay, so you learn from the mistakes of the pioneer. Okay, so let's look at, let me think of a good example of that. Well, we can use Uber and Lyft again. Uber and Lyft were not the first taxi service, right? Taxis have been around for a long time. I think Uber launched first, and then Lyft launched. They learned from the mistakes. So maybe the mistakes of the taxi industry is maybe where Uber learned from. Maybe there's a better way to do it. And then maybe Lyft learned from Uber's mistakes along the way. Right? I think they learn from each other, by the way. Every time one of them has a public snafu, they change course, so it can be good. Okay. But the follower then exploits that market potential, following on those mistakes that the pioneer makes. Okay. Let's look at social media. How many of you use social media in some shape or form? Okay. Facebook wasn't the first. Friendster, MySpace were before it. And I'm proud to say I never had any of those accounts, just Facebook, okay? Because I didn't even know social media was back then. But they both screwed up, okay? They made mistakes, and then Facebook came in, and based on those mistakes, built what, I don't know if it's better or not, because I don't use social media anymore, but they exploited the market potential from those mistakes, okay? They weren't the pioneer, they weren't the first mover. They were a follower. So specifically, I don't know all the specific mistakes. I can tell you from a little bit of background. I worked for this company that was acquired by EDS, and it was a startup in the cloud space, and MySpace was one of their clients. So when I was there, when Fox, I don't know which version of Fox or News Corporation it was, but anyways, MySpace was bought by Fox at the time, or News Corp again. I don't remember which one. They really. They built a product that people were using, and then I don't know what happened. They kind of lost their way, and they started branching out to make it a music page where you could share music or something. But that was around the same time that music was becoming legitimate again, because when the digital streaming or digital media started happening on the internet. So go back to the 90s, people bought CDs at the CD store in the mall, okay? And then in the early 2000s, geeks started taking that music off the CDs, ripping it, and then sharing it online. So you could go download free music. And has anybody heard of Napster before? Okay. Napster was famous for building a music sharing site. Has anybody ever seen the Metallica Napster little animated parody thing? Beer, Napster, bad. Beer, good. The guy from Metallica, I can't think which one, Lars or something like that, okay? Napster built a music sharing site. And it was very successful. The problem was it was too successful. It started cannibalizing the music industry. The revenues plummeted. And so lawsuits erupted. That was around the same time that MySpace started allowing you to share music. I don't know. Does MySpace still exist? I have no idea. Okay. Whereas Friendster was from what I understand, because I never was on it, like I said, Friendster was a social network kind of like Facebook. And I don't know what happened. I think newer ideas came out that were better, and Friendster basically stopped being popular. MySpace kind of pivoted in a different direction, and people stopped using MySpace. It became more of a music sharing site. Right around the time that Apple launched the, not the iPod, but the iPhone and stuff, and made it where legitimate music was cool again. You go buy stuff through iTunes, and you get better quality, and you don't have people, the lawyers from the music industry knocking on your door, which, by the way, will happen. I know a guy that I went to law school with who works for the media industry, and that's all he does is sue people like you. And the threat of a letter and a lawsuit makes most people pay up. Okay? You pay me $3,000 for my client because we caught that you downloaded music off the internet that wasn't owned by you, and this will go away. If you do not, we are going to sue you for a lot more money. It works. He drives a Porsche and lives in Malibu in a big mansion. So it's clearly a strategy that works for the music industry and also for the movie industry. Does both music and movies. So if you steal music and movies and stuff, that kind of happens. Okay. I totally forgot where I was going from that. But the music industry has changed, okay, and likewise Facebook and other things. Now, Facebook's had its own problems. I dropped off Facebook a few years ago, and my issue with Facebook was the way that they were dealing with the data. Okay, they're saying one thing, but then in their terms of service, they're bearing other language. So publicly, they're saying we aren't sharing this data, and then we find out they are sharing the data with these companies that are being using it for let's say unique purposes. Okay. Those companies may be first movers in that area. So that could be the case. Okay. Imitation. Okay. So Walmart didn't come up with a unique idea. They weren't the first mover in this space. Has anybody ever heard of Woolworth or Ben Franklin? These are like the original Walmarts. In fact, Sam Walton originally worked for, I don't remember if it was Woolworth or Ben Franklin, but those were the Walmarts of the early 20th century before Walmart came about. Okay. What he did, though, was he improved upon that model. Based on their mistakes, he improved on it. They were in very small storefronts, not a lot of selection, rural areas. He started building superstores in the early 60s that sold everything under the sun at a very low price. And then in the 80s, he went into the grocery field and also started adding groceries to his stores. Okay. Airlines. JetBlue copied Southwest model of low fares, no frills, although they did have a couple of frills on their planes. Okay. And JetBlue, I believe, has been, at least from what I understand, has been pretty successful. Not as successful as Southwest probably, but they're still pretty successful. They're still growing. You contrast that to some of the other low-cost airlines that failed. Does anybody remember Song? That was Delta's attempt at a low-cost airline. Didn't last very long. Okay. United had TED. Okay. My favorite is Independence Air. Has anybody heard of Independence Air? It was the best deal for students. I lived in DC at the time. It was awesome. You could pay a monthly fee and get unlimited airplane trips anywhere in the country. They flew everywhere, okay, and very frequently. So, and you didn't have to book a ticket ahead of time. You just would show up at the airport and say, I want to fly today. And you would just get on a plane and you could fly. Unlimited travel. It was awesome when I was younger and finished up college, okay? It wasn't a sustainable model, though. Now, maybe we'll get to that point where there's a sustainable model around that. Technology and innovation strategy, okay? The invention is the initial development of that product or process. Innovation is when we actually apply it and it's adopted in the market somehow, okay? Now, commercialization can be very challenging. I'll give you an example of the photocopier. Sometimes people call it, excuse me, the Xerox machine, okay? Generally, my parents' generation calls it that, okay? The photocopier process was invented about almost 80 years ago now. It took 4 years before the first company was willing to try it out on a license, like you license it and start using it, okay? It took another 3 years to get a prototype built. That's a long time, 7 years from the time it was invented. But it took 18 years from the time it was invented to the time it actually was successfully brought to market, okay? Now, I saw the first Xerox copier in a junk pile when I was a kid, okay? And where I saw it at doesn't matter, I guess. But anyways, they were trying to fix it and they had no way to fix it. But it was this mammoth beast, okay? None of us would want to stand there and make copies on this thing. It was so primitive compared to what we use today, okay? But that's how long things can take. It can take a very long time. Again, review those pages in the book for more information, and then the new technology ventures is a template, okay? So that's chapter 4 and 5. We got through those a little quicker than normal. Now, I wanted to leave a little time at the end of class for any project questions that people have. So, project questions. Anybody? Nobody. Okay. Is everybody on track for the concept paper tomorrow? Is anybody still trying to get into a group because time's a wasting? Okay. For your meetings, if you're having trouble, I don't think this class is an issue because I don't think we have very many groups that are large. But if you're struggling to meet up with your groups, my suggestion is to maybe break your group in half to work on things like meet. If you can't meet all at once, assign some things for each half to work on, and then have 2 people from that group just get together, okay, to reconcile. If you've got a larger group in the class, I think there's one group of 8 or something like that, okay? If that's an issue, right? If not, we'll go ahead and dismiss a little early today. And then on Thursday, we're going to go into the next chapter, okay? Bring up your meeting minutes if you don't already have them up here, please. I only see a couple.